In the suffocating heat of summer 1862, deep in the pine forests and swamplands of rural Georgia, there lived a blind black girl whose hands could see what her eyes never would. She had been born into slavery on the Hartwell plantation in Burke County, delivered by a midwife who noticed immediately that the infant's eyes were clouded and milky, showing none of the normal response to light that healthy newborns exhibited. The child would never see sunlight, never witness her mother's face, never observe the world of color and form that most humans took for granted. Yet this girl, whose given name was lost when the plantation records were destroyed during Sherman's march, but who the enslaved community called the one who sees with her soul, would create maps of extraordinary accuracy depicting places she had never visited, routes she had never traveled, and landscapes she could never have observed with physical sight. She drew on any surface available, scratching lines into dirt floors with sticks, marking walls with charcoal stolen from cooking fires, occasionally receiving precious scraps of paper that she would cover with detailed representations of terrain, waterways, hidden paths, and secret passages. Her maps showed things that shouldn't have been possible for her to know. The location of caves used by escaped slaves, routes through swamps that avoided Confederate patrols, safe houses on the Underground Railroad, even the positions of military encampments and supply routes. When tested, when people actually followed the routes she had drawn, they found that her maps were accurate. Not perfect, but far more precise than chance or guessing could explain. The enslaved community believed she possessed a gift from God or the ancestors, a form of sight that operated beyond the physical limitations of eyes and light. White society saw her as either a curiosity to be studied or a threat to be controlled, depending on whether her abilities seemed useful or dangerous at any given moment. When Confederate officers discovered her maps in late 1861, she was taken from the plantation, removed from her mother, from her community, from everything familiar, and transported to a military medical facility where doctors attempted to understand and exploit her extraordinary ability. She never returned home. But years after her disappearance, during the final months of the Civil War, Union troops discovered and used routes through Georgia that matched exactly the maps this blind child had drawn. Routes that helped Sherman's army move through terrain that Confederate forces had believed was impassable. This is not just a story about an unexplained medical phenomenon or a spiritual mystery. This is a story about a black child who found ways to see and to contribute and to resist, even when every physical and social limitation said she should be helpless. This is a story about knowledge that existed outside conventional learning, about gifts that couldn't be stolen or suppressed, no matter how thoroughly slavery tried to reduce human beings to property without agency or capability. This is a story about one girl whose blindness became a different kind of vision, whose disability became a form of power, and whose brief, tragic life revealed truths about consciousness, perception, and human potential that science still struggles to fully explain. Before we continue with the story of the girl who drew maps in darkness, if this account is capturing your attention, make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss our explorations of the most mysterious and profound stories from Black American history. And please let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from, and whether you've heard stories in your own family about people with disabilities who developed extraordinary abilities that seemed to compensate for what they'd lost. We love hearing from our community around the world. The girl was born in the spring of 1852 on the Hartwell plantation, one of the largest cotton-growing operations in Burke County, Georgia, a region where the economy depended entirely on enslaved labor and where the institution of slavery had become even more entrenched as cotton prices rose and abolition movements in the North intensified Southern defensiveness about their peculiar institution. Her mother, whose name appears in plantation records only as Ruth Fieldhand, had been enslaved since birth, purchased as a child from a failing plantation in South Carolina, and brought to Georgia as part of a larger group sale. The girl's father was never identified in any records, though whispered speculation among the enslaved community suggested he might have been one of the white overseers, a common enough occurrence in a system where enslaved women had no ability to refuse sexual advances from men who held power over their lives and bodies. The birth itself was unremarkable, except for the immediate recognition that something was profoundly wrong with the infant's eyes. The midwife, an elderly enslaved woman named Mama Claudine, who had delivered hundreds of babies over her lifetime spanning more than 60 years, noticed that the newborn's eyes appeared clouded and gray, with pupils that didn't react to light the way healthy eyes should. When she held the baby up to a lantern, moving the flame closer and then farther away, there was no pupil constriction, no tracking of the light source, no indication that the visual system was functioning normally. The cloudiness wasn't like cataracts that might be surgically removed. It was something deeper, something structural in the eye itself that suggested the visual processing system simply hadn't developed correctly during gestation. "This child won't see the world with her eyes," Mama Claudine told Ruth as she placed the infant in her mother's arms, her voice carrying both sympathy for the suffering this would cause and warning about the dangers it would create. Whether she's completely blind or just very poor-sighted, I can't say for certain without more time to observe her. But those eyes aren't working right. You can see it in how they don't respond to light, how they don't focus on anything, how they just stare without seeing. You need to prepare yourself for raising a child who'll need extra help and protection in a world that's already brutal to all of us, because the master won't keep her if he thinks she can't work eventually. Blind slaves get sold off cheap to whoever will take them, sometimes to people who exploit them for begging or for spectacle. Or sometimes they're just left to die if they can't find a buyer. Some plantations kill disabled babies outright, calling it a mercy not to let them suffer in a world that has no use for them. You'll have to prove she has value, or they'll take her from you one way or another. Ruth looked down at her daughter, this tiny, vulnerable being who would face the horrors of slavery with an additional burden that most enslaved people didn't carry, and made a decision that would shape everything that followed. She would teach this child to be valuable despite her blindness. She would help her develop skills and abilities that would make her indispensable to the plantation community, that would give plantation management reasons to keep her alive and keep her together with her mother. It was a calculation that enslaved parents had to make constantly. How to help their children survive in a system designed to destroy them. How to cultivate whatever capabilities might offer protection or value in a world that saw black people as nothing more than property to be used and discarded when no longer profitable. Ruth named her daughter Clara, a name meaning bright or clear. A deliberate choice that asserted the child's potential and worth despite the physical limitation that clouded her eyes and would deny her visual sight. It was an act of defiance, small and private but meaningful, naming a blind child after clarity and light as if to insist that vision came in forms beyond what eyes could provide. As Clara grew from infant to toddler, the extent of her blindness became clear to everyone who interacted with her. She had some light perception. She could sense when she moved from darkness into bright sunlight, could tell when a lamp was brought near her face, would turn her head slightly towards strong light sources, as if recognizing their presence if not their specific form. But she had no form vision, no ability to distinguish shapes or colors, or to navigate using visual cues the way sighted people did automatically, without thinking about the complex processing their brains performed constantly. Her world was one of sounds, textures, temperatures, and smells. She learned to identify people by their footsteps and breathing patterns, could tell who was approaching before they spoke by recognizing the rhythm of their gait and the particular sounds their shoes or bare feet made on different surfaces. The heavy, measured tread of male overseers, the quick, light steps of children, the shuffling exhaustion of field workers returning after long days. She learned to navigate familiar spaces by counting steps and using her hands to trace walls and furniture. building mental maps of her environment that were based on movement and touch rather than on visual observation. She learned to understand her environment through senses that most sighted people barely noticed they possessed. The way air moved differently in open spaces versus enclosed rooms, creating subtle pressure and temperature variations that her skin detected. The way sounds echoed differently depending on the size and shape of a space, bouncing off walls at angles that her ears interpreted as spatial information. The way different materials felt against her skin and transmitted temperature in distinctive ways. The cool smoothness of water-worn stones, the rough grain of pine boards, the soft give of packed earth versus the hardness of clay soil. But she was also developing abilities that seemed to go beyond simple compensation for blindness, abilities that suggested her mind was working in ways that weren't typical even for blind people who developed heightened sensitivity in their remaining senses. By age 3, she could identify plants by touch with accuracy that amazed the community's herbalists and healers who had spent decades learning to distinguish hundreds of plant species by leaf shape, stem structure, root characteristics, and dozens of other features that required careful observation and extensive experience to master. Clara would run her small fingers over leaves and stems and roots, feeling textures and patterns that her hands somehow translated into recognition of species and even specific individual plants. She could tell the difference between plants that looked nearly identical to visual inspection, but which had subtle variations in leaf texture or stem structure that her sensitive fingers detected and her brain processed into accurate identification. The elderly women who gathered herbs for medicine and cooking began bringing her along on their foraging expeditions into the woods and fields around the plantation. And they discovered that she could locate useful plants faster than they could, as if her hands could sense something about the plants that drew her to them even before she touched them. She would walk through underbrush and brambles, her hands extended in front of her, moving with a confidence that seemed impossible for a blind 3-year-old child, and she would say, "Medicine here," or "food here," and would reach down to exactly the right spot to pull up roots or gather leaves that the experienced foragers had been searching for. When asked how she knew where to find these plants when she couldn't see them, she couldn't explain in terms that made sense to the adults questioning her. She would say things like, "I can feel them calling," or "they want to be found," or "the good plants feel different from the other plants, like they have warmth in them even when they're cold to touch." One of the herbalists, an old woman named Esther, who had been gathering and preparing medicinal plants for more than 50 years, observed Clara carefully during these foraging trips and came to a conclusion that she shared only with Ruth and with Mama Claudine. This child doesn't just have good touch or good hearing that lets her compensate for being blind, Esther said during a quiet conversation one evening. She has something else, something I've never seen before but that I've heard about in the old stories from Africa, from before the slave ships. There were people who could see without eyes, who could perceive the world through spiritual sight that went beyond physical senses. The slavers tried to beat that knowledge out of us, tried to make us forget the old ways. But some gifts persist because they're not learned. They're born into certain people. I think Clara has that gift. She sees, but not with her eyes. She sees with something deeper, something that connects her to the world in ways that most people lost when they started depending only on their physical eyes. By age 4, Clara was demonstrating a spatial awareness that defied explanation for someone who had never seen space visually, who had no framework of visual reference for understanding how objects related to each other in 3-dimensional environments. She could navigate the slave quarters without hesitation, walking confidently between buildings and around obstacles without the shuffling, hesitant gait typical of blind people in unfamiliar environments. She didn't need to use a cane or to keep her hands extended protectively in front of her to avoid collision. She walked with confidence, turning and stopping and moving around obstacles as if she could somehow sense where things were before reaching them, as if her awareness extended beyond her body in ways that created a perceptual buffer zone around her. When asked how she knew where walls or posts or other people were located, she couldn't explain in ways that made sense to sighted observers who tried to understand her experience through the framework of their own visual perception. She would say things like, "I can feel where the walls are," or "I know the spaces between things," or "Empty air feels different from air where something solid is, like the air gets thicker or harder when there's something in it," in ways that suggested she was perceiving the physical layout of her environment through some sense other than vision, or even through some integration of multiple senses that produced a coherent spatial awareness that functioned like vision, even though it operated through completely different mechanisms. Mama Claudine, watching Clara navigate the quarters with increasing confidence and speed, consulted with the oldest members of the enslaved community about whether anyone had ever heard of abilities like this. One very old man, nearly 80 years old, and one of the few people on the plantation who had been born in Africa and who retained clear memories of his homeland before he was captured and sold, told her about people in his village who could see in the dark or see without looking, people whose perception extended beyond their eyes in ways that allowed them to navigate at night, to locate lost objects, to sense dangers before they became visible. "We called them the ones who walk between the worlds," the old man said, his voice barely audible, weakened by age and by decades of hard labor. They could see into the spirit realm and the physical realm at the same time. They were valuable to the community because they could perceive things that ordinary people missed. But they were also vulnerable because their gifts made them targets. Other villages would try to capture them, would try to use their abilities for warfare or for finding resources. When the slavers came, they took everyone. But they especially wanted people with unusual abilities because those people brought higher prices. I wonder if this child's gift comes from ancestors who had those abilities, if it's something that's been passed down through blood and spirit even when the knowledge of how to train it was lost. And then, when Clara was 5 years old, she began to draw. It started simply, scratching lines in the dirt with a stick while other children played around her, making patterns that initially seemed like purposeless doodling of the kind that children often engage in when bored or restless. But Mama Claudine, watching the child work one afternoon while supervising a group of children too young to work in the fields, noticed that the patterns weren't random. They had structure, organization, recurring elements that suggested intentionality rather than random mark-making. The lines connected to each other in ways that seemed deliberate. There were angles and curves that repeated in consistent patterns. Certain marks appeared multiple times as if representing repeated features or landmarks. The old woman knelt down beside Clara and asked what she was making, curious about whether the child had any conscious awareness of what her hands were creating or whether this was purely unconscious expression. "I'm showing the path," Clara said, her clouded eyes staring at nothing while her hands moved confidently across the dirt surface, adding lines and marks with the stick she held. "The path from here to the big water, the path that goes through the dark trees and the moving ground." She was describing with surprising accuracy for a 5-year-old child who had never traveled more than a few hundred yards from the slave quarters where she had been born, the route from the Hartwell plantation to the Savannah River. A journey of more than 20 miles through terrain that included thick pine forests and treacherous swampland that shifted between solid ground and sucking mud, depending on recent rainfall and seasonal water levels. It was a route Clara had never traveled, never seen, and had no conventional way of knowing. Yet her scratched map showed the general direction, indicated where the path had to detour around impassable areas of deep swamp, even marked what seemed to be specific landmarks along the way. A large oak tree that marked a turning point in the route, a creek crossing where the water ran shallow enough to wade even in wet seasons, a hill that rose above the surrounding flatland and that served as a visual landmark for sighted travelers trying to orient themselves in the confusing landscape of similar-looking pine forests. Mama Claudine's heart raced as she looked at the map scratched in dirt, understanding immediately both what she was seeing and what it might mean for this child if the wrong people learned of her abilities. Maps like this, maps showing escape routes, hidden paths, ways to move through dangerous territory without being seen by patrols or by hostile whites who would capture and return runaways for the bounties that were offered, were precious and dangerous knowledge in the enslaved community. People who knew such routes and could guide others along them were invaluable to the underground railroad network that helped enslaved people escape to freedom in the North. But such knowledge was also lethal if discovered by white authorities. Anyone caught with maps or information about escape routes would be brutally punished as an example to others, beaten until permanently disabled, maimed by having tendons cut or toes removed to prevent running, sometimes killed in ways designed to terrorize the entire enslaved population into absolute submission and to discourage any thoughts of resistance or escape. "Child, where did you learn about this path?" Mama Claudine asked urgently, looking around to make sure no one else was watching or listening to this conversation. No one who might report what they'd heard to plantation management or to overseers looking for evidence of Underground Railroad activities. "Who told you about the river route? Did some traveler describe it to you? Did you hear adults talking about it when they thought you weren't listening?" Clara's clouded eyes remained unfocused, staring past Mama Claudine at nothing, at spaces and distances that her physical eyes would never perceive, but which her mind seemed to navigate with ease and confidence. "Nobody told me," she said in her quiet, certain voice that seemed too old and too knowing for a 5-year-old child who should still be playing games and learning basic skills, not creating geographic intelligence that could change lives. "I see it. I don't know how to explain what I mean because I don't have words for it. I see it in my mind, but not like pictures. I don't know what pictures are like because I never seen anything with my eyes. But I know it's there. I can feel the shape of it, the way the land goes, where the water is, where the trees are thick and where they're thin enough to walk through. It's like I'm touching it with my mind instead of with my hands, like my thoughts can reach out and feel places even when my body hasn't been to those places. And when I draw it, my hands know where to go. Something guides them, tells them where to put the lines. I just hold the stick and my hand moves and the path appears on the ground." Over the following months, Mama Claudine and a few other trusted members of the enslaved community quietly tested Clara's ability, trying to understand its limits and its reliability, while being extremely careful not to let white people on the plantation know what they were investigating. They would ask her about places, sometimes places they knew well from their own experience, sometimes places they had only heard about from travelers or from other enslaved people who had been sold from one plantation to another and who carried geographic knowledge from their various experiences. And Clara would scratch maps in dirt or mark them with charcoal on any surface available, the sides of buildings, flat stones, occasionally precious scraps of wood that could be saved and studied more carefully. Her maps of the immediate plantation area were remarkably accurate, showing buildings, paths, field boundaries, water sources, the locations of specific large trees that served as landmarks, all with precision that shouldn't have been possible for someone who had never seen these things visually and who had limited mobility because blind children weren't allowed to wander freely for fear they would hurt themselves or get lost and create problems for the adults responsible for supervising them. But even more extraordinary were her maps of places she couldn't possibly have any conventional knowledge of, distant towns she had never visited, river crossings she had never seen, roads and trails dozens of miles away that she had never traveled. When compared to actual geography, when people who had traveled to these locations examined her maps and evaluated their accuracy against their own knowledge of the terrain, they found that she was capturing real features of the landscape with precision that far exceeded random guessing or lucky coincidence. She wasn't perfect. Her sense of scale was sometimes off. compressing or expanding distances in ways that didn't match actual mileage, making short distances seem longer or long distances seem shorter in patterns that didn't follow any consistent rule. She occasionally missed features or misplaced them relative to each other, putting a landmark on the wrong side of a river or showing a building too far from a road. But she was capturing genuine geographic information through some process that no one could explain or understand. Information about terrain features, water sources, vegetation density, human structures that existed in the real world, and that matched her representations far more often than chance alone could account for. The child has the gift of sight that goes beyond eyes. Mama Claudine told Ruth one night when they could speak privately, well after dark, when the exhausted field workers had collapsed into sleep, and when whispered conversations could be held with minimal risk of being overheard by those who might report such talk to plantation authorities looking for any sign of resistance or forbidden communication. I don't know if it's God-given or ancestor sent or something else entirely that we don't have words for, but she sees things no eyes could show her. She perceives the world in ways that go beyond the senses we understand. This is powerful, and power in the hands of enslaved people is always dangerous because white folks fear any ability they can't control or explain. We need to be very, very careful about who knows what she can do and about how we use this gift. It could save lives. It could help people escape, could show safe paths through dangerous country. But it could also get her killed, get all of us killed if the wrong people find out and decide that she's too dangerous to let live or that her abilities threaten the system in ways they can't tolerate. Ruth understood the warning completely, having lived her entire life navigating the impossible calculations that enslaved people had to make constantly. When to hide abilities that might threaten white authority, when to demonstrate skills that might provide protection through perceived value. How to survive in a system designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimum support or recognition of humanity. But she also understood something else. Clara's gift might be the thing that kept her alive and valuable in a system that typically had no use for blind slaves, and that would normally sell such a child away for whatever minimal price she might bring, or simply let her die of neglect if no buyer could be found. If plantation management believed Clara had skills that could be useful to them, they wouldn't sell her away or abandon her to death through neglect. The key was finding ways to demonstrate value without revealing abilities that would seem too threatening or too strange, without showing capabilities that challenged white assumptions about racial hierarchy and black capabilities so fundamentally that the response would be fear and violence rather than exploitation of useful skills. The opportunity came when Clara was 6 years old in the summer of 1858, when plantation operations were expanding and when the overseer was looking for ways to improve efficiency. The plantation overseer, a man named James Whitlock, who had worked on the Hartwell plantation for 15 years and who managed the day-to-day operations of the enslaved workforce with a mixture of calculation and brutality, was planning to establish a new work site deep in the plantation's extensive pine forest, where enslaved workers would harvest timber for construction and would process turpentine from the resin-rich pine trees that grew abundantly in the region. The turpentine operation was potentially lucrative. The product was in high demand for use in paint, lamp oil, and various industrial applications that were expanding as the southern economy grew. But the forest was vast and confusing, with few clear paths and many areas of swampland that made navigation difficult and dangerous. Workers who were sent into the forest frequently got lost or took inefficient routes that wasted time and energy, spending hours wandering through dense undergrowth and around impassable wetlands when more direct paths might have been available if only someone knew where those paths were. Whitlock needed maps of the forest interior to plan efficient paths between the plantation's central buildings and the proposed work sites, to identify which areas could support timber operations and which were too swampy or rocky to be worth the effort of accessing. to locate sources of fresh water that could support workers spending long days deep in the forest away from the main plantation buildings. Professional surveyors were expensive and were generally employed only for important land transactions or major construction projects that justified their considerable fees. For something like internal plantation navigation, Whitlock was on his own to figure out the geography as best he could through trial and error and through the accumulated knowledge of workers who had spent time in the forests. Ruth, hearing about this problem through the network of communication that existed among enslaved people, despite white efforts to control and limit such information exchange, saw an opportunity that might protect her daughter while also demonstrating value that would ensure Clara wasn't sold away or left to die. She volunteered Clara to help, claiming that despite her blindness, the child had an extraordinary sense of direction and spatial awareness that might be useful for mapping, that she seemed to understand terrain and paths in ways that didn't require visual observation. Whitlock was deeply skeptical. The idea that a blind 6-year-old slave child could provide useful geographic information seemed absurd on its face, seemed like the kind of desperate claim a mother would make to protect a disabled child from being deemed worthless and disposable. But he was also desperate enough to try anything that might solve his mapping problem without the expense of hiring a surveyor. And the offer cost him nothing, since Clara and her mother were already plantation property whose labor he could command at will without compensation beyond the minimal food and shelter required to keep them alive and functional. He agreed to test Clara's abilities, bringing her into the forest accompanied by Ruth and by 2 enslaved men who knew the area better than most, having worked in timber operations for several years. For 3 days, they walked through the pine forest, the men pointing out landmarks and boundaries, while Clara listened and asked occasional questions about what she was sensing. Questions about sounds, about the feel of the ground under her feet, about changes in temperature or in the quality of the air, about the density of vegetation and the presence of water. She would stop periodically and stand perfectly still for several minutes, her head tilted as if listening to something the others couldn't hear, her hands extended as if feeling for something invisible, her clouded eyes staring at nothing while her mind seemed to be processing information from sources the sighted adults couldn't identify or understand. Then she would nod, and they would continue walking, following routes that sometimes seemed random, but which Clara insisted were important for understanding how the forest was shaped and where the connections between places ran. Then, on the evening of the 3rd day, she drew a map. Not in dirt this time, but on a large piece of salvaged wood using charcoal that Mama Claudine had provided, working for hours with intense concentration, while the adults watched in fascination and growing amazement. The map showed the forest layout with surprising accuracy and detail, indicating major trees that could serve as landmarks, paths that avoided swampy areas while still providing relatively direct routes between key locations, areas where clear ground would support work camps and equipment. She marked water sources, springs and small streams that the experienced timber workers confirmed existed in approximately the locations she indicated, sources they had discovered through years of working in the forest, but which Clara had somehow perceived after just 3 days of walking selected routes. She even showed variations in elevation, using different marking techniques to indicate hills and valleys and flat ground, conveying 3-dimensional information on a 2-dimensional surface in ways that suggested sophisticated understanding of cartographic representation, despite having no formal education in map-making or any other academic subject. When Whitlock had his men verify the map's accuracy by actually traveling the routes it showed and checking whether the features it depicted actually existed in the locations indicated, spending several more days exploring the forest with Clara's map as their guide, they confirmed that she had captured the geography with remarkable precision. She had somehow translated the forest, a place she couldn't see, and had only visited for 3 days on selected paths that didn't cover the full area she had mapped, into a useful navigational tool that proved its value immediately. Workers using her map could move through the forest much more efficiently than before, following paths that avoided the worst obstacles while still providing reasonably direct access to areas where timber operations would be profitable. Whitlock was impressed enough to keep Clara on plantation grounds rather than selling her away, which had been under consideration because blind slaves were generally viewed as economic liabilities who consumed resources without providing commensurate labor value. Instead, she became known as someone useful for spatial planning and route finding, occasionally consulted when plantation management needed to understand terrain or plan paths through difficult areas. It wasn't freedom, wasn't even close to fair compensation for her abilities or recognition of her humanity and her remarkable gifts, but it was survival. It kept her with her mother, kept her alive when many disabled enslaved children didn't survive to adulthood, gave her a role that made her valuable rather than disposable in a system that disposed of people casually when they ceased to be profitable. But it also made her visible in ways that would ultimately prove dangerous, in ways that Ruth and Mama Claudine had feared from the beginning. Word spread among the enslaved community about the blind girl who could draw maps, and that information reached people who had very different interests in such abilities than plantation management did. Representatives of the Underground Railroad network began to take notice of a child who could map escape routes through terrain she'd never seen, who could show hidden paths and safe passages through her drawings, who might be able to provide the kind of geographic intelligence that could save lives and facilitate freedom for people desperate to escape the brutality of slavery. In the winter of 1859, a free black man traveling through the region under the pretense of selling dry goods and simple tools made contact with Mama Claudine and asked about Clara, whose mapping abilities had become the subject of quiet conversation in black communities throughout Burke County and the surrounding counties in Georgia. He represented a network helping enslaved people escape north, working as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, risking his own freedom and his life to help others reach the free states where slavery had been abolished. And he had heard rumors about a blind child who drew maps that showed secret paths, who could perceive geography without seeing it, who might be able to help the network operate more safely and more effectively. Could she map routes that would help fugitives avoid patrols and travel more safely through dangerous territory? Could she show where to cross rivers without being seen by people who watched the main fords and bridges? Could she indicate where to find shelter during daylight hours when travel was too risky because searchers would spot runaways on the roads? Could she identify where Confederate sympathizers lived versus where abolitionists or free black people might provide help and protection? To fugitives. Mama Claudine was deeply conflicted about this request, torn between multiple considerations that all carried life and death consequences. Using Clara's abilities to help people escape to freedom seemed like a righteous purpose, a way to turn her strange gift into something that served her people's liberation, that contributed to the cause of ending slavery and helping individual humans reclaim the freedom that should never have been taken from them in the first place. The gift had to come from somewhere, from God or the ancestors, or from the deep spiritual traditions that had survived the Middle Passage and that persisted in hidden forms despite systematic attempts to erase African culture and spirituality. Surely such a gift was meant to be used for liberation rather than just to improve white plantation owners' profit margins. But it was also incredibly dangerous. Far more dangerous than using Clara's skills to help plantation management improve timber operations or plan work sites. If Clara was caught making maps for runaways, if any connection could be proven between her drawings and successful escapes, if anyone informed on the network and implicated her, the punishment would be severe, likely death, not just for Clara, but for everyone associated with her, everyone who had knowledge of what she was doing. Ruth would be killed, probably tortured first to extract information about others involved. Mama Claudine herself would be killed. Other members of the enslaved community who had helped or who simply knew and didn't report would face brutal retaliation designed to terrorize everyone. The entire enslaved population on the plantation might face increased restrictions, harsher punishments, conditions made even more unbearable than they already were, as a lesson to anyone who might think about resistance or assistance to runaways. After much prayer and painful deliberation, after consulting with Ruth and with other trusted elders in the community, after weighing the potential good against the certain danger, after considering whether Clara herself should have any say in how her gift was used despite being only 7 years old, Mama Claudine decided to take the risk. Clara's gift was extraordinary and rare, perhaps unique in their experience and in the experience of everyone they had consulted. Using it only to help white plantation owners improve their operations while people suffered and died in bondage seemed like a waste of divine blessing or ancestral gift, seemed like a betrayal of the higher purposes that such abilities must serve. They would have to be extremely careful, would have to maintain absolute secrecy, would have to ensure that no connections could be traced between Clara's maps and any specific escape attempts. But they would use her gift to help people flee toward freedom, because if her abilities came from God or the ancestors as the community believed, then surely those divine or spiritual sources intended for the gift to serve liberation rather than oppression. Beginning in late 1859, Mama Claudine began working with Clara in secret, always in hidden locations and always with trusted people standing watch to ensure no one observed what they were doing. She would ask Clara to map specific routes that the Underground Railroad needed, paths from the Hartwell plantation to the Savannah River where boats might carry fugitives further north, routes through Georgia toward Tennessee, and eventually to free states beyond the Ohio River, locations of safe houses and stations where fugitives could hide during daylight hours when travel was too dangerous, areas where Confederate patrols were known to search versus areas that were largely ignored because the terrain seemed too difficult to navigate. Clara would draw these maps on whatever surfaces were available and safe, pieces of wood that could be hidden under floorboards or in secret compartments, smoothed dirt in isolated locations that could be memorized before being erased with a foot or a broom, occasionally precious scraps of paper that traveling agents could carry with them concealed in their belongings or could destroy quickly if they were in danger of capture. Her maps proved extraordinarily useful to the Underground Railroad operations in Burke County and the surrounding region. Fugitives following the routes she mapped found that the paths were real, that the river crossings she indicated existed and were passable at the depths and locations she showed, that the landmarks she marked helped them navigate even in darkness when travel was safest, but when normal visual orientation was impossible. Her maps weren't perfect. Sometimes distances were compressed or expanded in ways that threw off timing estimates. Sometimes features were misplaced by a mile or two, making navigation confusing. Sometimes paths she showed as clear turned out to have obstacles she hadn't detected or that had appeared after she created the map. But they were far more accurate than random knowledge or lucky guessing would produce, and they included details that seemed impossible for a blind child who had never traveled these routes to know. The existence of specific caves that could provide shelter and that weren't marked on any official maps. The locations of springs that provided fresh water in areas where surface water was scarce or contaminated, even warnings about areas where aggressive dogs or hostile residents made passage, particularly dangerous and where alternate routes should be chosen. She sees with something other than eyes. One Underground Railroad conductor told Mama Claudine after successfully using Clara's maps to guide a group of 7 escapees through dangerous territory from Burke County to Augusta, and from there to connection points that would take them further north toward eventual freedom. I don't know if it's a gift from God or from the ancestors or from something else entirely that we don't have names for, but that child perceives geography in ways I've never encountered in decades of this work. She showed me a cave system that I didn't know existed, marked a spring that saved our lives when we ran out of water in a stretch where I thought there were no sources, warned us about a patrol station that was exactly where she said it would be even though it hadn't existed the last time I traveled that route, They'd established it recently, and she somehow knew about it, despite being confined to the plantation and having no way to learn about new military positions through conventional means. However she's doing it, whatever process allows her blind mind to see terrain and features and even changes in the landscape, it's real, and it works, and it's saving lives. People are reaching freedom because of maps drawn by a blind child who's never seen the routes she's showing them. For nearly 2 years, from late 1859 to late 1861, Clara continued this secret work, producing maps that helped dozens of enslaved people, perhaps as many as 50 or 60 individuals, though exact numbers are impossible to determine given the necessarily secretive nature of Underground Railroad operations that couldn't keep detailed records that might be discovered and used to identify and punish those involved. She never knew most of the people she helped, never heard their stories or learned their names, or discovered whether they successfully reached freedom or were captured and returned to slavery. She just drew the maps when asked, sitting in quiet corners or hidden spaces, her hands moving confidently across whatever surface was available, creating representations of landscapes she could only perceive through whatever mysterious sense allowed her blind mind to see geographic space and terrain features. The maps she drew during this period showed increasing sophistication and detail as she gained experience and as she learned what information was most useful to people trying to navigate dangerous territory. She began including information about seasonal variations, routes that were passable in summer when water levels were low, but which became impassable in winter when rivers swelled with rain and when swamps expanded. She marked areas where guard dogs were kept, where overseers lived who were known to be particularly vigilant about watching for runaways, where free black people or sympathetic whites might provide assistance in the form of food, shelter, or warnings about patrols. She even began indicating timing information, how long different segments of routes might take to travel based on terrain difficulty, where people should plan to hide during daylight hours to avoid being spotted, how to coordinate movements with the phases of the moon that would provide enough illumination for nighttime travel without the risk of carrying torches or lanterns that might draw attention from miles away. When Underground Railroad conductors compared her maps with their own hard-won knowledge of Georgia geography, accumulated through years of dangerous work guiding fugitives toward freedom, they found that she was often showing them routes they didn't know existed. Safer passages than the ones they had been using, details about terrain, and features that improved their effectiveness significantly and that reduced the risks of capture. A blind child who had never traveled more than a few miles from where she was born, who couldn't see the landscape even when she did travel, was producing geographic intelligence that exceeded the knowledge of experienced travelers who had spent years mapping the Underground Railroad network through direct observation and dangerous trial and error. But networks of secrets rarely remain secret forever, especially when the stakes are as high as they were in the slavery-based economy of the pre-Civil War South, where every escaped slave represented lost property value measured in hundreds or thousands of dollars, and where successful escapes encouraged others to attempt flight, threatening the entire system of forced labor that Southern wealth depended upon. Someone, whether an enslaved person who hoped to gain favor with white authority by revealing Underground Railroad activities, or a white person who noticed suspicious patterns of escapes from the Burke County region and began investigating their methods, or simply bad luck that led to the discovery of one of Clara's maps during a routine inspection or search, discovered that maps were being created on the Hartwell plantation, maps that showed escape routes and safe passages with detail that suggested careful planning and inside knowledge rather than desperate improvisation. In October 1861, Confederate soldiers raided the slave quarters looking for evidence of Underground Railroad activities, following information they had received from sources they didn't disclose, but which clearly implicated the Hartwell plantation in facilitating escapes that had cost local plantation owners significant amounts of money in lost property. They found several of Clara's maps, pieces of wood marked with charcoal showing detailed geographic information about the region, routes marked with clear indicators of direction and key features, notations about distances and timing that suggested these were functional navigational tools rather than idle drawings. They found testimony from informants claiming that a blind slave girl was creating these maps and that they were being used specifically to facilitate escapes, passed to conductors who carried them north or who memorized them before destroying the physical evidence. And they found Clara herself, this small, vulnerable child with clouded eyes who couldn't see the soldiers surrounding her, but who must have heard their boots and their voices and their threats, who must have understood that something terrible was about to happen even if she couldn't comprehend the full scope of what her mapping had meant or what consequences were about to unfold from her strange gift being discovered by people who saw her abilities as threats to their economic interests and to the social order that slavery maintained. The soldiers brought Clara, along with Ruth and Mama Claudine, and several other enslaved people suspected of involvement in Underground Railroad operations, before plantation owner Samuel Hartwell and the local Confederate military commander, a captain named William Thornton, who had been tasked with suppressing escape networks in the region and who had authority to interrogate and punish anyone suspected of aiding runaways. The interrogation that followed was brutal. Not physically at first, though physical violence was implied constantly through words and gestures and through the visible presence of whips and other instruments of torture. And physical violence would surely follow if the interrogators didn't get answers they considered satisfactory. But the psychological brutality was immediate and devastating for all involved, and particularly terrifying for a 9-year-old blind child who was suddenly the focus of hostile white male authority, demanding explanations for things she barely understood herself. When questioned about how she made the maps, Clara could only repeat what she had always said, that she could see the terrain somehow, even though her eyes didn't work. That her hands were guided when she drew as if something beyond herself was directing them. That she didn't understand the mechanism herself, but she knew the maps were accurate, because she could feel the places they represented, as if she were touching them, even when they were miles away. When asked who had taught her to make maps, who had told her what routes to draw, she insisted truthfully that no one had taught her, that the knowledge came from inside her own mind in ways she couldn't explain or describe adequately because she had no reference point for understanding how other people perceived the world or how her own perception differed from normal experience. When asked how many maps she had made and who had taken them and used them to facilitate escapes, she couldn't answer with precision because she had never kept count, had never asked what happened to her drawings after they were completed and taken away by people she trusted, had never been told the details of specific escapes or which maps had been used for which journeys. She knew she had been helping people escape to freedom, knew that her maps were being used for Underground Railroad operations, but she had been deliberately kept ignorant of specifics to protect both herself and the network in case of exactly the kind of interrogation she was now facing. To test her claims and to determine whether her abilities were genuine or whether the entire situation was some kind of elaborate fraud perpetrated by the enslaved community for reasons the authorities couldn't quite identify, Captain Thornton had Clara brought to a room in the plantation house where she'd never been before, gave her charcoal and a large piece of paper that had been salvaged from somewhere, and asked her to map the route from the Hartwell plantation to Augusta, Georgia, a city more than 30 miles away that she had never visited and that lay beyond any territory she could possibly have conventional knowledge of through direct experience or through verbal descriptions detailed enough to create accurate maps. She drew for several hours, her hands moving steadily across the paper while her clouded eyes stared at nothing, while the soldiers and plantation management watched in fascination and growing unease at what they were witnessing. When she finished, the map showed the road between the Hartwell plantation and Augusta with remarkable accuracy, not perfect, with some compression of distance in some areas and expansion in others. with some features misplaced by small amounts, but capturing the general route, major river crossings, significant landmarks along the way, even some side paths and alternate routes that experienced travelers would recognize as real geographic features rather than imagined details. "This is impossible," Captain Thornton said, comparing Clara's map to official military maps of the region that he produced from a leather satchel, studying both maps carefully and noting the correspondences and the differences. "This child has never traveled this route, has never seen any maps. She's blind, for God's sake. She couldn't read a map even if someone showed her one. She has no formal education whatsoever, has never been taught geography or surveying or cartography or any academic subject. Yet she's produced geographic information that largely matches our surveyed maps, that shows features and routes that actually exist. How? How is this possible? What mechanism could account for this?" No one could answer that question with any scientific or medical explanation that Captain Thornton found satisfactory or even comprehensible. Some of the enslaved people who were questioned suggested she must have been secretly taught by travelers, must have had access to verbal descriptions of geography that she memorized and then reproduced in visual form through some combination of excellent memory and spatial reasoning. But investigation proved that no such teaching had occurred. Clara's blindness was congenital and complete, present from birth with no possibility of vision, and she had never had access to formal education or to travelers who might have described routes in sufficient detail for her to create maps this accurate. The enslaved community had deliberately kept her isolated from too much information, specifically to protect her from situations like this interrogation. Others suggested trickery or fraud, that Clara must be pretending to be blind as part of an elaborate deception, or that the whole situation was a conspiracy by the enslaved community for reasons that weren't entirely clear, but which must involve deception of white authority. But medical examination conducted by the plantation's physician confirmed that Clara's blindness was genuine and severe, with structural problems in her eyes that made vision impossible, with no possibility that she was faking disability or that she had any functional vision that would allow her to see maps or landscapes visually. Some of the enslaved people who were questioned, particularly Mama Claudine and the old man who had memories of Africa, suggested that Clara had a gift from God or from the ancestors, that she had been blessed or chosen for a special purpose, that she could see through spiritual means rather than through physical eyes. But this explanation was dismissed immediately and contemptuously by Confederate authorities, who had no framework for understanding or accepting such possibilities, who viewed claims of supernatural or spiritual abilities in enslaved people as either primitive superstition to be ridiculed or as dangerous assertions of power that needed to be suppressed through violence and control. What Captain Thornton ultimately concluded, and what would seal Clara's fate and separate her permanently from her mother and her community, was that regardless of mechanism, regardless of whether her abilities had natural or supernatural explanations, she represented both a potential intelligence asset and a serious security threat to Confederate interests. Her ability to accurately map terrain could be extremely useful to Confederate military operations if it could be controlled and directed toward military purposes, helping them understand geography in contested areas, planning movements through regions where good maps didn't exist, potentially even gathering intelligence about Union troop positions if her perception extended to detecting human presence and movements the way it seemed to detect terrain features. But she had already been using that ability to help enemies of the Confederacy and to undermine the institution of slavery that the Confederacy was fighting to preserve. She had facilitated dozens of escapes, had helped valuable property flee to the north where it would never be recovered. She had demonstrated that her loyalty was to her people and to freedom rather than to the white authorities who claimed to own her. She couldn't be left in the enslaved community where her abilities might continue to serve Underground Railroad purposes or might be used against Confederate military interests by those who would seek to exploit her gifts for Union advantage. She needed to be removed, controlled, studied, and potentially exploited by Confederate authorities who would ensure that any intelligence she produced would serve their purposes rather than working against them. She was too valuable to kill, too potentially useful to discard, but too dangerous to leave where she was. The solution was to take her away, separate her from everyone and everything that might influence her toward resistance, and attempt to understand and harness her abilities for Confederate benefit. In November 1861, 9-year-old Clara was taken from the Hartwell plantation in a scene that would haunt everyone who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. She was separated from her mother despite Ruth's desperate pleas and physical resistance that resulted in Ruth being beaten severely and publicly for daring to fight against white authorities' decision about the disposition of property that wasn't hers to keep or protect. Ruth was held down by soldiers while Clara was carried away, screaming, calling for her mother in a voice that tore at the hearts of everyone in the enslaved community who had loved this strange, gifted child. Clara was separated from Mama Claudine, who had delivered her and protected her and helped her develop her gifts. She was separated from the entire community that had valued her despite the additional challenges her blindness created, that had found ways to make her useful and important, that had loved her not despite her disability, but as a complete person whose blindness was just one aspect of who she was. She was loaded into a wagon with no adequate explanation of where she was being taken or what would happen to her, alone and blind and terrified, leaving behind everything and everyone she had ever known, torn away from the only sources of safety and care and love she had experienced in her brief 9 years of life. The last words Ruth heard from her daughter, shouted over the sounds of horses and wagon wheels and Ruth's own screams of protest and grief, were heartbreaking in their simple acceptance of a fate the child couldn't control or prevent. Heartbreaking in the way they tried to offer comfort to a mother who was losing her child and who had no power to stop that loss. "Mama, I can't see you with my eyes, but I can feel where you are in my heart. Even when they take me far away, I'll still feel where you are. The world is all connected, Mama. Every place touches every other place. Every person touches every other person. Nothing is ever really separated. I'll find my way back to you somehow. I promise I'll find my way back." Ruth never saw her daughter again. The girl was transported to a Confederate military medical facility in Atlanta, where doctors and officers attempted to understand and exploit her extraordinary abilities, to determine whether they could reliably use her mapping skills for military intelligence purposes, to figure out the mechanism behind her abilities in hopes of either replicating them in other subjects or at least understanding them well enough to maximize their utility for Confederate interests. What happened during her time in Atlanta is documented in fragmentary records that were largely destroyed during the war, either deliberately burned by Confederate authorities retreating from advancing Union forces who didn't want sensitive documents falling into enemy hands, or accidentally destroyed in the chaos of Sherman's march through Georgia when so much documentation and so many buildings were consumed by fire. But portions that survived in various archives, letters written by medical personnel to family members or colleagues, brief mentions in military reports that escaped destruction, later testimony from people who had worked at the facility and who remembered the blind black child who drew impossible maps, provide a window into what she experienced during those terrible months. The medical facility in Atlanta was a converted warehouse, hastily repurposed to serve as both a hospital for wounded Confederate soldiers and as a research center where doctors studied unusual medical cases and attempted to develop intelligence assets that might provide Confederate forces with advantages over the Union. The conditions were harsh, overcrowded, poorly heated in winter, stifling in summer, with inadequate medical supplies and with personnel who were overworked and often indifferent to the suffering of patients who couldn't contribute to the war effort. Clara was given a small room on an upper floor, barely more than a closet, with a narrow bed and a single small window that provided light she couldn't see, and air that often carried the stench of infected wounds and death from the floors below. She was examined extensively, her eyes tested repeatedly as if the doctors hoped to find that her blindness was somehow faked or reversible. Her head measured with calipers as phrenologists tried to find physical explanations for her abilities in the shape of her skull. Her other senses tested to determine whether she had developed compensatory abilities that might account for her map making. And she was made to draw maps, many maps, day after day, week after week. The doctors and military intelligence officers would name locations and ask her to map them. They would describe terrain features and ask if she could locate similar features in surrounding areas. They would give her partial information and see if she could fill in missing details. They tested her accuracy by comparing her maps to existing surveys, tested her range by asking about increasingly distant locations, tested her limits by seeing how much detail she could provide and how consistently her maps matched reality. What they discovered both amazed and frustrated them. Her maps were consistently better than chance, definitely capturing real geographic information, but they were never perfectly accurate, and the accuracy varied in ways the doctors couldn't predict or control. Sometimes she would produce remarkably detailed and precise maps. Other times her maps were vague or contained significant errors. She couldn't explain why. She could only say that sometimes she could see the places clearly, and sometimes they were hazy or confused in her perception. Dr. Thomas Brennan, the senior physician assigned to study Clara, documented his observations in a journal that survived the war and that was eventually donated to a historical archive. This child represents a phenomenon that medical science cannot currently explain through any known principle of physiology or psychology, he wrote. Her abilities appear to be genuine. She consistently produces geographic information that exceeds what random guessing would allow and that often matches reality with remarkable precision. But we can find no mechanism to account for how she accesses this information. Her remaining senses are acute, but not beyond normal human range when enhanced by blindness. Her brain seems normal in the measurements we can perform. She has no access to maps or to information about the areas she depicts. Yet somehow, she perceives geographic features and translates them into representations that often prove accurate when tested. The toll on Clara was severe and increasingly obvious. Personnel at the facility reported that she became progressively more withdrawn as weeks turned into months. She spoke less and less, stopped responding to questions unless forced, showed less and less of the personality and spirit she had demonstrated initially. She stopped eating adequately, refusing food or eating only when threatened with punishment. She lost weight until her small body became skeletal. She stopped sleeping more than a few hours at a time, spending nights sitting motionless or rocking back and forth in the repetitive self-soothing behavior that traumatized children develop when trying to cope with circumstances they cannot understand or control. She began scratching at her own arms and face during episodes of distress, creating wounds that became infected in the unsanitary conditions of the facility. She would sometimes scream for hours, calling for her mother in ways that disturbed even hardened soldiers. She was clearly suffering, clearly being destroyed by her captivity and by the relentless demands placed on her. But the Confederate authorities saw her primarily as an intelligence asset rather than as a child who needed care and protection. In September 1862, as Union forces advanced toward Atlanta, and as Confederate resources became increasingly strained by the war's demands, the decision was made to evacuate the medical facility. Clara was transferred to another location. The records are unclear about where, possibly Macon or Charleston or Mobile. The documentation is fragmentary and contradictory. After that September 1862 transfer, the trail goes completely cold. No subsequent records identify her. No documentation tracks her fate. She simply disappears from history, one of countless enslaved people whose lives and deaths went unrecorded and unmourned. Ruth searched for her daughter until her own death in 1891, never finding any information, never learning what happened, never achieving closure. "They took my baby because she could see things that frightened them," Ruth told a Freedmen's Bureau interviewer in 1867. "They studied her and used her and then threw her away when she wasn't useful anymore. I don't even know if she's alive." But Clara's maps survived. Several that she drew in Atlanta were preserved in Confederate records captured by Union forces. And in late 1864, during Sherman's march, Union officers discovered that some of these maps showed routes through Georgia that proved remarkably accurate and useful, including one map of swampland south of Savannah that showed a passage Union troops successfully used to move through terrain Confederate forces had believed impassable. "This map gave us significant tactical advantage," General Oliver Howard wrote to Sherman in January 1865, yet Confederate records indicate it was drawn by a blind slave child. "I cannot explain this. I can only report that the map worked." Modern historians studying the surviving maps find them genuinely accurate when compared to modern surveys. The debate continues about whether Clara had some form of extraordinary perception or whether conventional explanations might account for her abilities. But researchers in the black community offer a different perspective, that Clara possessed a gift connecting to African spiritual traditions of divination and ancestral knowledge, that her blindness freed her to develop spiritual sight that sighted people typically never cultivate. Whether Clara survived the war, whether she lived long enough to use her gifts freely during Reconstruction, remains unknown. But there are hints, accounts from the late 1860s of a blind black woman helping the Freedmen's Bureau locate separated families. A woman who seemed to know where missing people might be found with uncanny accuracy. Whether this was Clara is speculation, but it offers hope that maybe she survived. Maybe she found ways to use her gift for healing rather than for war. Maybe she lived long enough to choose for herself. The legacy of the blind mapmaker extends beyond her individual story. She challenges assumptions about disability, demonstrates that gifts manifest in unexpected forms, and stands as testimony to countless extraordinary black people whose abilities were exploited rather than celebrated. Her story reminds us that disability is not inability, that slavery tried to reduce black people to property, but could never fully extinguish extraordinary capabilities that persisted despite systematic oppression. Her name was lost. Her fate remains unknown. But her maps endure as testimony to a life that mattered, to abilities that defied explanation, to a blind black child who could see what others could not, and who used that sight to show paths to freedom, even when she herself remained in bondage. What do you think? Do you believe Clara truly possessed extraordinary perception, or could conventional explanations account for her abilities? Have you heard stories about people with disabilities who developed remarkable capabilities? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story important, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share this video. Remember that black brilliance has always existed in forms dominant society refused to recognize, that disability is not inability, and that the truest sight comes not from eyes, but from the soul. See you in the next video as we continue uncovering hidden stories of remarkable black people whose lives challenge us to expand our understanding of human potential.